What is poppin' YouTube? Back again with another video. Today we're doing my top 4 overdrafted players in 2023 fantasy football. I think these guys are going a little bit too high because I don't think their situations are great. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. On our way to 500 subs. Let's go. Now, the first player I believe is being overdrafted in 2023 fantasy football is Rhamondre Stevenson. Now, Rhamondre Stevenson came out of nowhere last season where you're drafting him in the RB dead zone and provided absolutely great fantasy football points with RB 10 fantasy points per game statistics last season. Now, when we look at this Patriots offense, we can say to ourselves, it is not great. You're looking at the wide receivers and there's a bunch of nobodies. I mean, they signed Juju Smith-Schuster. You got Mac Jones as the quarterback. So then you're like, well, Caleb, I think Rhamondre Stevenson is going to be in for another big year where last season he had 6 total touchdowns, he had 69 receptions, and he had 210 carries. So he had almost 270 touches. The issue for me comes with them adding in Zeke Elliott. With them adding in Zeke Elliott had over 12 total touchdowns last season in the Dallas Cowboys offense. Now, the Dallas Cowboys offense was a little bit better than what this Patriots offense is, but even still, if Rhamondre Stevenson only got 6 total touchdowns last season, is there the upside that he still gets 6? Or he still gets 7? Worst case scenario, he's getting less than 6 total touchdowns because the year before that he only had 5. So we haven't even seen Rhamondre Stevenson get in those double-digit touchdown marks, and you're having a guy coming in to steal that goal line work with Zeke Elliott. And that doesn't make me excited when you're having to draft Rhamondre Stevenson as RB11. If RB10 on his points per game basis last season was as high as we've seen him get, and all of a sudden now you add in a very capable backup in a system that loves to run a running back by committee, I just cannot get behind this Rhamondre Stevenson price tag, and so I am passing on him at this current price tag. He's my first overdrafted player in 2023 fantasy football. My second overdrafted player in 2023 fantasy football is going to be Brandon Aiyuk. We've been talking about Brandon Aiyuk for years in the dynasty community with the potential that this man has to be an elite level producer because of the way that he separates and his elite level talent portfolio. But it's not only 2 seasons ago when Brandon Aiyuk, after his amazing rookie season where he put up 15.4 fantasy points per game, was the wide receiver 18, came out and was in the doghouse with Kyle Shanahan. And being in the doghouse with Kyle Shanahan made him get off to a slow start, and 2 seasons ago only put up 10 fantasy points, wide receiver 39 on points per game basis. Last season was out of the doghouse, but only put up 13.4 fantasy points per game, put him as the wide receiver 23 on a fantasy points per game basis. So you're saying to yourself, well, Caleb, Brandon Aiyuk, he's a wide receiver too. What do you have against him? Especially last season, 113 targets. He had more targets. The offense was just a little bit better. Coming into this season with Brock Purdy, why are you against Brandon Aiyuk, especially with Deebo Samuel saying that Brandon Aiyuk has taken that next step? The reason that I'm against Brandon Aiyuk is because he's currently being drafted as wide receiver 25. You're having to draft him in the top 50 picks. And while you could say, yes, I love the upside of Brandon Aiyuk, there's guys around him that I much rather prefer. There's guys like Deontay Johnson, Christian Kirk, Jerry Jeudy, Chris Godwin. I prefer all those guys, and they're all going later than Brandon Aiyuk. Now, I know the upside's there. I know the 49ers are going to be a good offense. But really, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, those are going to be the first 2 main targets. And then you got CMC in the backfield. We haven't seen a full season of CMC with Brock Purdy. And all of a sudden, we are excited for all these weapons. But with all these weapons, is Brandon Aiyuk really, as the 4th option, going to get enough volume to produce high-end wide receiver 2 numbers again? I just don't know. And I would rather be taking shots on these guys later on because I think they have even more upside to get in that back-end wide receiver 1 to high-end wide receiver 2 category that you're trying to get to when you're drafting these wide receivers. Brandon Aiyuk is my second most overdrafted player in 2023 fantasy football. My third most overdrafted fantasy football player is Gabe Davis for the Buffalo Bills. Now, every year we seem to try to talk ourselves into the wide receiver 2 for the Buffalo Bills offense. The same exact way that we try to talk ourselves into these wide receivers for the Kansas City Chiefs offense, same exact thing we're doing here with Gabe Davis, where it's not only a few seasons ago when in the playoffs he had 4 total touchdowns, we saw that elite level deep threat that he is, and we keep saying to ourselves, man, if only he could pull in, he's like Mike Evans. If he could just do what Mike Evans does, all of a sudden Gabe Davis is going to be such a value. Last season, 11.4 fantasy points per game, put him as the wide receiver 36 on 92 targets. 92 targets in 15 games. That's just not great with only 48 receptions. So it is literally deep ball or bust for our man Gabe Davis. Now I know Stephon Diggs is a little bit unhappy with the situation, but what did the Buffalo Bills go out and do? They went out and got Dalton Kincaid in the first round, a pass catching tight end. You still have Dawson Knox, and you have a bevy of slot wide receivers. And all of a sudden we're just going to say to ourselves, same exact thing argument with Brandon Aiyuk, that, well, they got to throw to somebody else other than Stephon Diggs, so it's got to be Gabe Davis. I don't think that's necessarily the answer because I think last season, wide receiver 36 on a fantasy points per game basis is his absolute ceiling. And when you're having to draft him right now as the wide receiver 35, you're having to draft him above his absolute ceiling. And I could be proven wrong. Gabe Davis could come out, absolutely ball out. But the fact is, Gabe Davis, we haven't seen that elite level breakout. And my man is 24 years old. He's been in the league for 3 seasons. So typically if a breakout was going to happen, it was going to happen last year. Unless we're talking some Corey Davis type situation where Gabe Davis is finally going to emerge this season, I just don't see it. The Bills have been very heavy in trying to go after other wide receiver options like DeAndre Hopkins earlier this offseason, where they know Gabe Davis is not the answer. And so I know Gabe Davis is not going to be the answer for my fantasy football team, and that's why I think he's my 3rd most overdrafted player in 2023 fantasy football. And my 4th and final most overdrafted player in fantasy football is going to be Michael Thomas. Now I hear what you're saying, Caleb, you've just literally listed off 3 wide receivers, man. You must absolutely hate wide receivers this year. That's not the case at all. You must also just absolutely hate Michael Thomas. Do you not remember what he did the last few years ago? Dude, I'm an Ohio State Buckeyes fan. I know what Michael Thomas can do. I know how good he can be. But he hasn't been able to get on the field. And he's burned me year after year after year. I mean, we're talking 2019, wide receiver 1, fantasy points per game, and then the next year after that, only 7 games. The year after that, only 3 games. And yes, in the 7 games that he played, 12 fantasy points per game. And last year, in the 3 games he played, 22 targets, 16 receptions, 3 total touchdowns, 17 fantasy points per game. I've heard people say, well, Michael Thomas is just the discounted DeAndre Hopkins, but Michael Thomas might even be better. I understand where you're coming from when you're saying that, but Michael Thomas is also 30 years old. We do know when we've had an injury-prone wide receiver, and that man gets to 30, it's not like just because he wasn't taking hits on the field, doesn't mean that all of a sudden Father Time's going to come back and reverse his age. That's not how it works. And now put him in this offense where, of course, you still have Alvin Kamara, you got Kendra Miller, you have Jamal Williams in the backfield, but now you have Chris Olave, a younger, healthier version of himself. They still have Rashid Shaheed, and you have a bevy of tight end options. Now, Michael Thomas with Derek Carr. Of course, the quarterback play is going to be a little bit better this season than it was last season where you had Jameis Winston, Andy Dalton. It just wasn't great quarterback play. And so, of course, we think Derek Carr is going to take that step up, but you look at this offense and can you really say to yourself, even if Michael Thomas is healthy, and that's a big if, can he get back to that 186 targets that he had in 2019? I don't think so. I think you're probably going to be talking about him as a guy that gets 80 to 95 targets a season if he even plays the whole season. And I think that's the big if. Can he play this whole season? And where you're drafting him, we're talking about drafting him as the wide receiver 46 at his position. And so you're saying to me, Caleb, well, who else are you drafting around him? You're talking about Elijah Moore, Sky Moore, Rashad Bateman, Treylon Burks, Kadarius Toney. And while you could say, we've seen Michael Thomas get that volume. We haven't seen any of these guys get the volume that I'm going after them. I prefer Elijah Moore. I prefer Sky Moore. I prefer Treylon Burks. I'm taking all these upside shots on these younger wide receivers. For as much as they might have their own injury risks currently associated with them, I don't care. I'm taking these guys and I am running instead of drafting Michael Thomas. Because I think the age and day of drafting these old wide receivers, like we've seen it with Julio Jones, the value always seemed to be there because he was getting older. Good on the field for 2 games, you'd be like, wow, the old Julio's back. And then something happened. A hammy would happen. And I'm not predicting an injury for Michael Thomas, but based on the last 2 seasons, can we predict anything else? And so that, my question, is why I think he's the 4th most overdrafted player currently in 2023 fantasy football. I'd be rather taking these other wide receivers. There's some other running backs currently in the range, and even just waiting and drafting a quarterback there would be something that I would be willing to do over Michael Thomas. So let me know down below. What do you think of these 4 most overdrafted players in fantasy football? Do you agree with any of them? Have you drafted them? Do you disagree with them? Let me know down in the comments. Would love to talk with you. As always, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We're almost to 500 before the season starts. I want you to part of this community as we pursue fantasy football championships day in and day out. I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.